Chapter 9. The Firearms Editor. If the gentle reader has some feelings of sympathy for the ex-law officer case adrift with no visible means of income, perish the thought. I was happy as a cowboy at a barbecue, for I had a job, not as well paying as a stipend from the Border Patrol, but quite enough to make ends meet, for I had contracted with the magazine Outdoors, published in Boston by Clayton Daleholt Ernst, to write the guns copy. I had, for several years before the bust-up with Kelly, the head of the BP, been writing stories, articles, and various copy on sporting firearms. Most of these yarns were on the handgun, but not all of them. The old man was the ranking firearms editor, and various acquaintances, in a slightly malicious slant, had accused me of trading on the major's name. Maybe I had, for all that. At any rate, when I decided to turn my suit with the Border Patrol, we, the little bride and myself, were at the Nationals at Camp Perry. I think I would if I were you, she responded. They don't appreciate all the good publicity that you have brought the outfit, she continued. Over a half-century of supporting the man Askins, the little bride has never wavered. A more staunch supporter no man ever had than this Frau of mine. Many times I have been wrong, and probably this was one of them, but she never wavered. Quit him, she advised. We'll do all right. And so we did. We moved out of El Paso and went to live in the Rio Grande Valley above El Paso. We had a 12-room house built entirely of adobe, with 3-foot walls, and painted a striking white. About these quarters was 30 acres of alfalfa, all irrigated from the Rio Grande. Of course, the alfalfa wasn't mine, and indeed the house cost $35 monthly, but it was a great hideaway for the budding author. Chucky, now old enough to ride a horse, had a paint named Puglug. He rode the caballo across the alfalfa at a gallop, short legs clutching the bare sides, without vestige of a saddle. While in the patrol, I had very religiously practiced never less than 3 times weekly. Once on my own, the routine suffered. As a matter of fact, I pretty much gave up shooting matches and never got back to it again, except rather haphazardly. I'd persuaded the old man to move down from Oklahoma, and he lived in the valley and was only a few miles distant. We shot together constantly, and it was a source of pleasure to me to go by and gather him up and hie us away for a day on the Gamble's quail of the Rio Grande. The Major had been the firearms editor of Outdoor Life for 26 years. He had gone with the magazine when it belonged to John McGuire and was located in Denver. When old John passed, the book belonged to his son, Harry. The younger moved the publication to Illinois. He was closer to his printers there, and as times were precarious, this was probably dictated by reasons of economy. Harry was flighty and unpredictable. In no time at all, he sold the magazine to an Eastern organization. He passed out of the picture, and the new editor was Raymond Brown. By this time, my old man was 80 years of age, and his copy had slipped pretty bad. He tended to reminisce about his shooting, and this editor, Brown, did not like that. Another contributor to the book was Jack O'Connor, who was at the time a PR man for the University of Arizona. O'Connor made a great impression on Brown, so one day Brown told my old man that he was through and that he was going to put O'Connor in his spot. My father had a very good friend in Phil Whipple, who was the longtime editor of Sports Afield, so he simply sat down and knocked out a note to his friend, and in the next mail he had a new job. He remained as a firearms editor of Sports Afield until he died. It is generally forgotten today, but Major Askins was the best authority on sporting shotguns that this country has ever seen. He was the author of a half-dozen books, most of them on the scattergun, and these, when in circulation by a generation now largely gone, were accepted as the most authoritative. It had been a prime aim of mine not to write simply on sporting firearms, but to become a Western story writer, a doer of fiction, if you will. Once settled in the big white house, as we referred to our ample quarters, I got to work on some cowboy sagas. These, it proved, were all duds. I simply did not have the gift for fiction. My plots were contrived all too blatantly, and my characters too wooden. After a half dozen trials, I gave up and went back to doing field tests on guns and writing about them. Outdoors, never a very robust publication, and bedeviled by a serious shortage of coin of the realm, had to finally go bi-monthly. Had I known the outdoor magazine game as well then as I do now, I could have foreseen its forthcoming demise. But I hung on. The only drawback was that the $150 monthly was now reduced to $75. Clayton Ernst, the publisher, concerned about the striated stipend, told me I might write for other magazines, and this I did with a vengeance. During the succeeding year, I made $4,200, which for 1940 was a very good take. My most profitable source was Raymond Brown in Outdoor Life. Although I was pissed off at Brown for releasing My Old Man, I did not in the least hesitate to deal with him when it came to my stories. We finally reached an accord where he accepted a story every other month. Outdoor Life paid the somewhat lofty figure in those days of $300. After the second of these checks, the little bride and I journeyed down to town and paid off all our outstanding debts. We were feeling pretty elated over our prosperity. Despite the fact that I really wasn't practicing enough to shoot top-notch, I went off to the Texas pistol matches, which were fired that year at Austin. I was by this time the state champion some 5 times over. I concluded I might as well go back and make it 6 straight. At the matches was Lieutenant Charles Densford, a bird who had given me trouble at the 8th Corps area matches. He had fired only 9 shots at the 50-yard stage of the Clark match, and had then contended that the 10th shot had gone through another bullet hole. This was contested, not by me, but by others, and finally went to the NRA for final decision. If Densford got that 10th shot, he would win the Clark, a national trophy. If he lost, I would get the match. The NRA, after some months, finally gave up its decision. The 10th shot had been found. I often wondered how many big thumbs had been crowded through the bullet hole before the decision was handed down. At any rate, the trophy, a very handsome statuette, was handed over to the flyboy. I was pissed off at that. At any rate, and more lately, he had written some disparaging remarks about me and the American Rifleman, and I made up my mind when I next caught up with him I'd whip his ass. Densford was at the Texas matches, stationed at nearby Randolph Air Force Base, San Antonio. It was easy for him to come up to the state capitol for the annual powder burning. As soon as I saw him, I walked up to him and said, "I want a word with you behind the stands." He looked a little wild-eyed, but he followed me behind the stands. As soon as we were out of sight, I laid one on him. He came in swinging, and we had it toe-to-toe for a minute. A crowd gathered, and Boss Thorpe, the chief of police of Austin, came running up, pulled out a 6-shooter and put it behind my ear, and said, "Charlie, you son of a bitch, quit right now, or I'm gonna blow your goddamn head off." I went home and resigned from the NRA. Had I not submitted a prompt resignation, I'd have been kicked out anyway. I beat the rap by a hair's breadth. It was a regrettable and certainly a pretty sorry ending to a career which had seen me win the Texas Championship 5 times, the National Championship once, the NRA All-Around once, and been high on all the All-American teams. No doubt, had I taken the time to contemplate the aftermath, I might have been a little more patient with Densford. These days we are quite good friends. I had, by a fairly accurate count shot, away 334,000 pistol cartridges over the 10 years I'd been shooting so intensively, had won 534 medals and 117 trophies, and while I was one of the best pistol shots in the country, I was not the number one. Only one of the top gunners. After World War II was behind us, I applied for membership again in the NRA. C.B. Lister, who had been the secretary at the time of the brouhaha with Densford, reinstated me. I had been a life member, and Lister saw to it that this status was reinstated. This was in 1940, and the market for a jackleg writer, confined to the Guns and Shooting magazine, was pretty limited. There were no publications, actually given over in their entirety to guns. The few were the so-called outdoors types, with a dosage of hunting, some fishing, and with departments devoted to boats, motors, dogs, game raising, game cookery, and miscellany of subjects. Only the American rifle was completely a guns book. Of course, with my current disgrace, I could not expect to sell to this staid old journal. For all that, I thrived and worried not one whit. Never much of worrier, I was a matter of fact as happy and carefree as only a laddie of 33 could be. I had a regular column in Outdoors, another in a funny little publication called Typographic, and I had gone into El Paso and talked to the editor of the El Paso Times, a likable hombre named Ed Pooley, into commencing a guns and hunting column. It paid peanuts, but it was income, however small, and I did not disdain it. But better than all this was a growing understanding between myself and Raymond Brown, the editor of Outdoor Life. Brown took more and more of my copy, and his regular stipend was more than I got out of the several other piddling sources. On the one hand, I was provoked at Brown that he had fired my old man, but on the other, I was grateful that he would buy my stories. Chris Fox, the local sheriff, asked me to coach his deputies, and I was glad to do this. Fox, a going hell for leather sort, asked me to sign on as a deputy, but I put him off. It would have been a full-time assignment and would have interfered altogether too much of my writing. Old man Harvey, the biggest banker in town, wanted to boom me for a spot with the Texas Rangers, but I knew full well this would take me away from El Paso. I was so staunchly dug in by this time that I requested that my name not be put forward. The National Guard took up a lot of my time. As a sergeant, I was involved every Thursday night with regular drill and its attendant duties. The Guard went to summer encampment down on the Gulf of Mexico at Camp Pelosius on the commencement of war in Europe, and with the obvious dangers of our joining the fray, the Guard intensified its preparations. We commenced to see new vehicles and a great deal of new equipment. We still had the old 03 rifle, but we had been given demonstrations on the new M1, and this excited the battalion. The company first sergeant got promoted to second lieutenant, and this got all the ordinary buck sergeants like myself highly excited. George Parker, who had the good judgment to go ahead with his CMTC summer camps until he finally got his commission, was a lot smarter than me. He was ready to go to extended active duty as an officer. Here I was in an infantry line company and only a 3-striper. I kicked myself more than once over my stupidity in not having pushed ahead with 2 more summers at the CMTC, and I'd then, like Parker, have had a commission. My hopes of being in line for the next commission from the ranks were none too bright. The company commander was a little fart named Pope, and I had always given him a lot of trouble. He did not like me, and I held him in the same high regard. I had little hope that he would ever recommend me if and when the battalion had another quota. I considered requesting transfer to another outfit, but had this been granted, I'd then find myself among strangers with a company commander and company officers who did not know me, and certainly they weren't likely to recommend me for an advancement to the exalted rank of shavetail. The prospects, any way I pondered them, were indeed dismal. Directly above my place was the New Mexico state line, and 30 miles onward was the sizable little city of Las Cruces. If you turn eastward at Cruces, you come in 20 miles to the San Augustine Pass, trail up over the San Andreas Mountains. On the far slope of the San Andreas and the Oregons, which are a continuation of the parent range, is the rancho of Jim Cox. This Cox, one of 3 brothers, all sons of a really tough old ranny, Ed Cox, had a sizable spread. It reached over to the highway between El Paso and Alamogordo and encompassed 50,000 acres. The Cox clan were an interesting tribe, for it was their old man, along with some neighbors, who had engineered the killing of Pat Garrett. This latter, killer of Billy the Kid, was an enemy, and his demise was none too savory. As a matter of fact, he was set up and gunned down with scant heed for the niceties. Be all that it is made Jim Cox all that as it may, Jim Cox was a fine hombre, a good friend, and a muchly valued ranchero, who had more blue quail than anyone in all that end of New Mexico. I'd run up to the Cox Ranch, called the St. Augustine, and with my old man as a companion, or maybe the little bride, and Chucky, we'd shoot a fine bag of the desert game. Always generous, always friendly, forever extending an invitation to return, Cox was the very personification of the open-handed, hospitable man of the West. I went off to war, and when I returned, I was shocked and infinitely saddened to see that in the very middle of the Cox Acres was White Sands Proving Grounds. It not only ruined the cow business for my amigo, but the kibosh on some of the finest quail shooting I've ever known. White Sands, maybe I should explain, was the site of some of our earlier testing of now obsolete ground-to-ground missiles like the Corporal. Elmer Keith came to see me, and along with him he had George Turner. The former I had known from our days at Camp Perry. Elmer had been there with the Idaho National Guard, and now, out of the Guard, he was mostly shooting coyotes for a living and writing an occasional story for the American Rifleman. George Turner was a rancher from Cimarron, New Mexico. Besides ranching, Turner was an inventor and designer. He had perfected a branding and dehorning chute for calves, and this he manufactured himself in Cimarron. Along with the chute, he had a scope mount, and that was when he and Keith got acquainted. The pair came to see me, and I enjoyed them. A strange pair, my good Frau hinted darkly. And truly they were. Elmer had on his Tom Mix hat, and Turner was so badly crippled he could hardly walk. Born without a hip joint on the right side of his leg, he necessarily rocked up and down and gave the man a most peculiar gait. Despite this considerable handicap, he did everything a normal person could do and asked no odds of any man. That fall, after the duo had gone home again, Keith to Idaho and Turner back to Cimarron, New Mexico, I accepted an invitation from George to come up and shoot elk with him. I accepted with a clarity. We were to hunt on the CS Ranch, the biggest spread in that end of New Mexico. Besides Turner and myself, there was Les Davis, who was a nephew of Ed Springer, the owner, along with this young laddie, just graduated from Princeton, was Henry Zargis, the horse foreman for the CS, and Salty Reed, who managed the fishing concession for the company at Eagle Nest Lake. Then there were some invited guests whose names from this time and distance slipped my mind. At any rate, we hunted elk for 2 weeks and lived on what was known as the Ring Place. Everyone killed a wapiti, but the bull that fell to my gun was a piddling youngster. I swapped the animal to a local cowboy for a walloping big bull he had taken. I want the meat, he said to me. Well, I want the horns, so I replied, so the trade was made. It was the most pleasant interlude and gave me material for a good story on elk hunting. During the summer of '41, we had a continual round of house guests. Every company rep who traveled into the Southwest came for a visit, and we were happy to see all of them. One of the best and most welcome was Harold Russell, who was a sales manager for the then struggling Federal Cartridge Corporation. Federal was scarcely recognized, and it took a lot of hustle on the part of the feisty little Russell to see that the outfit showed any kind of marginal profit. Harold Russell was barely 5 foot tall, but he was aggressive, not to say pugnacious, bad-tempered, and insulting, and I often wondered that he did not get his block knocked off. But he never did, and finally, about the time of his retirement, Federal really became solidly established. He was a fine person, and I was always glad indeed when he came a-calling. Then there was Colonel Walter Sigmund, who was a sales manager of Western Winchester. Walter was a phony from start to finish. He had been in World War I, but it was always quite obscure what he did. He was an arrant coward, and you may be sure he never put himself in any slight danger. To get ahead of my story a bit, Walter promptly volunteered when World War II got cranked up, and the Army wanted no part of him, but the Air Corps, not quite as selective, accepted Sigmund, promptly made him a full colonel, and eventually gave him command of a depot in Utah. He sat out the war right there, and you may be sure, had you visited the place, that Colonel Sigmund was more important than Georgie Marshall, the chief of staff of the entire Army. George Parker swung over out of Arizona. He had by this time quit the Border Patrol and was somewhat at loose ends. Little did he know that the Army would soon have a job for him. I was happy to see him, as was Dorothy and the growing young son, Chucky. The latter had his paint horse, and he showed Parker how he could ride. Parker, ranch-raised and all cowboy, approved of the Askins offspring and his good horsemanship. Parker and I shot together and yarned together and planned a trip for the Sierra Madre for the forthcoming fall. I should say that this amigo is something more of a friend to me. I never had a brother, and Parker filled the gap. I suspect that the ties which bind us are closer, perhaps, than I might have felt towards an honest-to-God sibling. It has been my observation that sometimes brothers aren't too close. The bond which holds Parker dear to me is as close as it is possible for two humans to enjoy. Whether he has the same affection for me, he has never said, but not being the demonstrative sort, it may or may not be. But as for my side, this scoundrel is indeed a partner. I have a sister, but I have no affection, scarcely at all, for her. The summer progressed most pleasantly, and between the writing which took up the mornings and afternoons, which were given over to shooting crows along the Rio Grande, dropping down to Clint, where there was a lively skeet club, or racing out to Huco Tanks, the headquarters of an old friend, Juan Escontrias, the months flew by luxuriantly. Came September, and one evening the little bride said, "I think maybe we'd better run in to Hotel Diel." This, let it be noted, was not a hostelry in the strictest sense, despite the name, which was sort of a misnomer. Hotel Diel was a Catholic sisters' hospital, and the one of the stalwarts therein was a fine medical doctor named Paul Gallagher. He had officiated when Chucky was born, and it looked this evening like we might need him again. We journeyed in, and Dorothy was tucked into bed. Within hours she had presented us with a brand new son. This one was William Askins, named for his maternal grandfather. I had never had a brother, and I was pleased and delighted that Chucky would have one. "Every old boy needs a brother," I assured him. "Yes, I know," he replied, "and I'm glad I've got one." We had been sure, the little mother and myself, that this would be another boy. It never entered my head that we'd have a daughter, and sure enough, we did not. Not that I had anything against girls, far from it, but I was just sure somehow this would be son number 2. We took him home, and were happy indeed. During November, on the invitation of George Turner and Les Davis, I returned to Cimarron, and we again saddled up for the annual Wapiti soiree. This time we went into the Shuri, which is hard against the present Vermeil Ranch. We were out for a couple of weeks, and everybody took a good bull elk. When we rode back into civilization again, we found the world turned topsy-turvy. The Japanese had bombed our fleet at Pearl Harbor, and we were at war. Personally, I was delighted. Life as a staff man on a 2-bit magazine had gotten pretty tame. Humdrum, as a matter of fact. I missed the action, and the gunplay, and the chance to shoot up some band of renegades. I knew full well I'd get the call from the 36th Division, as the Texas National Guard constituted the 36th Division when called to federal duty, and I was happy. Maybe now I'll be able to wangle that commission, I told myself. A week after my return home, I had a letter from Brigadier General Julian Hatcher. He was the second in command at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. Hatcher, an enthusiastic pistol shooter and a ranking firearms authority, was also a long-time officer in the U.S. Ordnance Department. "I can wrangle a commission for you," he wrote me, "if you would like to come into the Ordnance Corps." I didn't wait to write him. I wired, "Delighted to accept. Get me a first lieutenancy." Within 10 days I had engineered a transfer from the Guard to the Ordnance Department. I should explain, I believe that in the beginning it was known as the Ordnance Department. At the conclusion of the war, it was redesigned the Ordnance Corps, a small matter for a buck sergeant in the Texas National Guard to now be a shining new first lieutenant in the Army of the United States.